Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from around the world. My name is Allie Vanden Herrick, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at ShareVault. I would like to thank you for joining us for our webinar discussion today. This is the 72nd in ShareVault's webinar series, and our topic today is Patient Engagement Best Practices, the benefits without the risks. Based on the large number of registrations for this discussion, this is clearly a popular topic. I will briefly cover a few logistical items and then acknowledge our speaker's organization, Manatt Health. We'll then conduct a quick poll and I'll introduce you to our speaker and let him begin his presentation. At the end, we should have a few minutes for him to respond to audience questions. First, a few logistics. As a reminder, this is a 60-minute event scheduled to run from 11 a.m. to 12 noon Pacific. Secondly, your audio will be muted in order to minimize background noise. But if you have any questions you'd like our presenter to address, please submit them at any time through the Q&A feature located in your Zoom webinar panel. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And lastly, our presenter has generously offered to make the slide deck and a recording of today's presentation available. You will be notified by email when they are released. We also welcome your feedback after the webinar, which enables us to improve future webinars. We would be grateful if you would please take a moment to reply to the survey that we send in our follow-up email. We'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsor, Manatt Health. Manatt Health integrates legal and consulting expertise to better serve the complex needs of clients across the healthcare system. Combining legal excellence, firsthand experience in shaping public policy, sophisticated strategy insight, and deep analytic capabilities, Manatt provides uniquely valuable professional services to the full range of health industry players. Their diverse team of more than 160 attorneys and consultants from Manatt, Phelps & Phillips, LLP, and its consulting subsidiary, Manatt Health Strategies, LLC, is passionate about helping clients advance their business interests, fulfill their missions, and lead healthcare into the future. To learn more, please visit manatt.com/health. We'd also like to acknowledge today's co-sponsor, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. BIO is the world's largest trade association representing the biotech industry. They organize the BIO International Convention along with industry-leading investor and partnering conferences around the world. When collaboration is more vital than ever, you can still rely on BIO to bring the industry together. For 2020, the BIO International Convention will transition to a new virtual event format, BIO Digital, from June 8th through June 12th. This virtual gathering of the global biotech industry provides access to key partners via BIO one-on-one partnering, educational resources to help drive your business, and the insights you need to continue critical research and development. We may not be able to gather in person, but nothing stops innovation. To learn more and register, visit bio.org/bio-digital. Today's webinar is hosted by ShareVault. Many of you in the audience may already know about ShareVault's leadership in the life sciences industry as a provider of secure document sharing systems and virtual data rooms, and that ShareVault is the only system of its kind with life science specific features. You also probably know that ShareVault is commonly used in a variety of due diligence applications and for managing regulatory submissions and completed clinical master trial files. Clinical trial master files. It's because of these, but what you may not be aware of, I forgot one thing, is that ShareVault is now being used for securely monitoring clinical trials, especially with the recent shelter-in-place travel restrictions. And it's because of these and other unique capabilities, as well as its ease of use, that BIO and more than 50 life science associations have selected ShareVault for their member benefits programs. ShareVault also complements the tools you already are using, like Box, Dropbox, Office 365, SharePoint, and DocuSign. And we've added lots of new features in our latest release. In the wake of the pandemic outbreak and a shift to telecommuting, cyber attacks are on the rise, and criminals are taking advantage of organizations that have not implemented safe business practices to manage a distributed workforce. It's far too easy to lose control of confidential documents during this transition, but not to worry, ShareVault has you covered. ShareVault is the only cloud solution that is instantly deployable to function anywhere your files need to be protected. Learn how we can help enhance your organization's remote work capabilities with Dynamic Native File Protection, or DNFP. If you haven't experienced our cloud-based solutions firsthand, I suggest you pop a quick note in your chat window and we'll follow up with you to schedule a demo or to set you up on a free trial. And for a limited time, new users affected by the shelter-in-place orders will receive a month free. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Jeremy Lutsky. Jeremy has over 20 years of deep FDA regulatory, transactional, and in-house compliance experience, including more than 10 years working in-house with several prominent biotech and medical device companies. With an intimate understanding of the needs and inner workings of the pharmaceutical and medical device spaces, Jeremy provides counsel on a wide range of legal and regulatory matters, including FDA compliance, contracting, transactions, M&A, advertising, sponsorships, and promotional review. We are thrilled to have you with us today, Jeremy, to get your valuable insight on this interesting new topic. So welcome, and please feel free to begin your presentation.
Thank you. So I want to begin just thanking everyone for attending. I think this is an interesting and very relevant topic, patient support services, and so I'm going to get into it. I also want to let folks know in about 1 minute. So I'm aware that a lot of people are getting CLE credit, and so I'm going to be providing the codes for CLE at 11:10 Pacific time and 11:45 Pacific time. So I'm going to give you the first code in a second. Here, let me shoot. Sorry. Okay. So in terms of my outline, as you can see, we've divided this in that I'm going to give you an overview of patient support services and give you examples of patient support services and supplies and items. I'm going to go over the legal framework. Largely this analysis is going to be looking at the legal issues that tie to providing patient support services. Particularly, I'm going to focus on the Beneficiary Inducement Statute and the Anti-Kickback Statute. Then I'm going to get into some case studies, some real-world examples, including providing a sub-zero refrigerator, a patient starter kit, and items and services, and nursing and home health services. Finally, I'm going to conclude with best practices. And let me give you now at 11:10 Pacific the first CLE code. That is TCH295. Again, TCH295. Okay. So overview of patient support services. It's important to start out defining patient support services. Patient support means different things to different people. Some view it as different types of services that help patients through a rigorous treatment regimen. Others consider it an outgrowth of customer service and certain hub services. It also can consist of value-add supplies and services that aid with treatment compliance. It's important to be clear that patient support is different than patient access programs. There's been a lot written, and there's a lot of guidance around PAPs, or patient access programs, which allow for financial assistance for qualifying patients to provide access to medications that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, or can't afford or have access. Typically under PAPs, there's a need to demonstrate a need, a financial need, and to qualify in order to get coverage. I'm not going to be covering PAPs. I just want to make clear that distinction, but I'm not covering that in my presentation. So in terms of examples, again, there's lots of different examples that fall under the rubric of patient support services and supplies. Examples of services are nursing services, which are relatively prevalent, and I will cover in my example, such as assistance with injections, home health services, guidance, home health visits, and phone calls to check in on patients and assist with compliance with prescriptions. Supplies, examples of supplies are nebulizers to use with medication at home and other types of medical equipment, that may be provided to comply with prescriptions used at home. Utilization tracking tools. These are much increasingly prevalent in terms of, an example is a smart shops container that not only contains injectable materials, but it also tracks compliance and gives the doctor and the patient important information around compliance and utilization of prescriptions. An ultra cold refrigerator, which will be one of my examples, to house certain drugs which require sub-zero refrigeration. A recent OIG advisory opinion dealt with limited functionality smartphones being provided to patients. Another example of supplies are pumps, gauze, sharps, tubes, etc. And a home starter kit, which will always be an example, also be an example that I'm going to cover. So let's get into the important framework in terms of the legal considerations. I appreciated that a lot of you are legal in compliance from the survey questions, so hopefully this will be educational and relevant for you. So first, I want to talk about the Beneficiary Inducement Statute. The section cited of the Social Security Act, which is part of HIPAA, is commonly known as the Beneficiary Inducement Statute. The Beneficiary Inducement Statute outlines inducement provisions that, to the extent you violate the Beneficiary Inducement Statute, you will violate the Civil Monetary Penalties Act, and so there will be, by definition, monetary penalties, which come with, again, providing improper benefits to patients, which would run afoul of the Beneficiary Inducement Statute. So an important term, both under the Beneficiary Inducement Statute as well as the Anti-Kickback Statute, which I'll get to next, is remuneration. So under the Beneficiary Statute, any person who offers or transfers remuneration, which is anything of value to a Medicare or Medicaid beneficiary, that the person knows or should likely know will influence that beneficiary, typically the patient's selection of a particular provider, practitioner, or supplier, violates the statute. And so to define remuneration, as I've touched upon, remuneration is a transfer of value other than fair market value. So it's something of a low fee or free. And examples are gifts, meals, furnishing of supplies, services, or equipment, which are either provided for free or well below market value. So it's important in terms of understanding the Beneficiary Inducement Statute. There was a recent, somewhat recent, from December 2016, OIG final regulation that helps discuss the Beneficiary Inducement Statute, and more specifically safe harbors to that statute. And to the extent that many of you are likely aware, a safe harbor doesn't guarantee that you're fine, but you're it's guardrails that if you stay within the guardrails, you are likely fine, or you're likely will not run afoul of government regulations and therefore be prosecuted. So, to the extent that you can fall within these safe harbors, that's very favorable in terms of not violating the Beneficiary Inducement Statute or the Anti-Kickback Statute that we'll talk about next. So a key safe harbor, which is identified in this December 2016 guidance, is the access to care safe harbor. So in that case, the OIG regulation included an exception to the statute, which permits certain remuneration that poses a low risk of harm and promotes access to care. So let's break that apart, and so we understand the safe harbor. There's three components of the safe harbor, which I'll get into. First is, what is care? Then what does it mean to promote access to care? And what type of remuneration poses a low risk of harm? So first, and again, you have to meet all three factors of this test to fall within the access to care safe harbor to the Beneficiary Inducement Statute. So care is, when you're considering whether an item or service will promote access to care, the OIG has stated that relevant care means any items or services provided to a Medicare or Medicaid beneficiary that are paid by Medicare or Medicaid. So the care is the item or service, and it has to tie to a prescription. Next, what does it mean to promote access to care? So, care is pretty easy to satisfy because, again, it just has to tie to a prescription that is covered, a prescription or service covered by Medicare or Medicaid. So if you meet that, then let's look at, do you promote access to care? Promoting access to care involves improving a particular beneficiary's ability to obtain care. Certain items and services that support access to care will make it more convenient also to meet the, to satisfy the care requirement will meet the exception. The OIG is focused on remuneration that helps remove obstacles or provides tools and resources that help a beneficiary access care. So that pretty easy to understand. This is the reason for this exception is the intent to assist the patients and beneficiaries getting care. So anything that is focused on patient care and takes away an obstacle to receiving that care, for instance, for nursing hotlines or nursing or home health services that allow patients to understand better how to use a particular prescription, is teaching them about home infusion or other compliance with a prescription, will provide enhanced access to care and removing obstacles to their receiving that care. Very important though, the OIG draws a line at remuneration that rewards patient adherence. So although, again, let's use nursing services as types of services that allow a patient to comply with a prescription and understand how to self-inject, understand how to take a prescription, understand questions around that, to the extent that you are rewarding their compliance by giving gift cards or other rewards, that is not covered within the access to care exception or safe harbor. And so it's important to structure it's important to structure any offerings or programs in a way that facilitates care as opposed to rewarding that treatment adherence. Next and finally, if you pass the second part of the test, what type of remuneration poses a low risk of harm? And there's a three-part test within this third prong of low risk to harm. Specifically, remuneration poses a low risk of harm if the items or services, one, are unlikely to interfere with, skew clinical decision-making. This is a key facet because the point behind this is that typically for these type of patient support services, they come after a prescription has been made. So you're not impacting the HCP making a prescribing decision. You're providing services or items subsequent to that prescription decision, which will help patients comply with that order and appropriate and help with patient outcomes and the like. But so I think that first prong is very important. Next, there's a low risk of harm if you're unlikely to increase costs to federal healthcare programs so if you're somehow adding to or impacting overutilization or inappropriate utilization, which provides for enhanced costs to the government, there's not a low risk of harm. And finally, to have a low risk of harm, you can't raise patient safety or quality care concerns. I use the nursing services example again because typically it's the opposite, is that if you are providing training or education, you are enhancing patient safety, you're enhancing quality of care, so you're not going to run afoul of the low risk of harm. In fact, you're minimizing harm. Another exception to that, we just covered the access to care safe harbor. Another safe harbor to the Beneficiary Inducement Statute is what we call the nominal value exception. In the December 2016 rule, the nominal value was moved from $10 to $15 per item and $75 in the aggregate. So that's important because, again, to the extent that you're providing something of very low value, of de minimis value, likely you will fall into the safe harbor, and so you will not be in violation of the Beneficiary Inducement Statute. The limitation on remuneration provides, as I've mentioned, for inexpensive gifts or items that are of nominal value. It can be often difficult to price out the exact value of certain supplies or services. And so it's hard to know. Sometimes it's very clear if you fall within that, but a lot of times it's unclear whether you meet this exception, the nominal value exception. Okay, so we've touched upon, there are kind of two key statutes that I'm going to touch upon that I think are important in terms of assessing whether your patient support systems or services or items are appropriate or whether they violate key statutes. One we've touched upon, the other one is the Anti-Kickback Statute. Most of you, or a lot of you, are probably very familiar, but just to again go over the definition of the AKS or Anti-Kickback Statute, it makes it a criminal offense to knowingly and willfully offer, pay, solicit, or receive any remuneration, we've covered that definition, to induce or reward referrals of items or services which are reimbursable by federal healthcare programs. The safe harbors, so it's important to note the safe harbors that we just covered to the patient beneficiary statute do not apply to the AKS or anti-kickback statute. So you always have to go through an anti-kickback statute analysis separate from the beneficiary inducement statute. In terms of patient support services, unfortunately, at least based on my research, there are not safe harbors that exist right now that currently cover or directly cover or touch upon patient support services in the same way that we have safe harbors on under the beneficiary inducement statute. But the good news is that in October of 2019, the OIG proposed a safe harbor that is highly relevant. Again, I want to make crystal clear that this is proposed. This is not an existing safe harbor, but we're going to go through it because it shows the direction that things are moving. And the reason that they've proposed this patient engagement and support safe harbor is that the OIG is recognizing the importance of patient engagement programs in managing and improving patients' own health outcomes. And the intent of this safe harbor is to remove or reduce current barriers prevented by the AKS that prevent providers or other healthcare entities from offering patients, and that could be vendors engaged by pharmaceutical manufacturers, as well as the providers themselves, from offering patient tools and supports that can, again, improve quality, outcomes, and efficiency. So the point of this, again, is there's an intent to not inappropriately influence provider decision-making or prescriptions or impact patients and their selection of drugs or devices, but there is an intent to remove barriers and allow patients to understand and access medications and devices and lead to improved outcomes and efficiency. So let's dig into the proposed patient engagement and support safe harbor. Remuneration, as we've talked about, would not include in-kind patient engagement tools or supports furnished directly by a value-based enterprise. So this is a little bit confusing, and I'll just dig in a little bit to this. It's connected to the coordination and management of care. So tools and supports that are considered remuneration might include healthcare-related technology, patient health monitoring tools. I'm sorry, that would not be, let me clarify, would not be considered remuneration and therefore in violation of the anti-kickback statute under this proposed safe harbor, would again be tools and supports that might be healthcare related technology, patient health related monitoring tools like the Sharps container I talked about, or services, supports and services designed to identify and address a patient's social determinants of health or their healthcare condition. So value-based enterprise participants may include vendors of care management services. So those are vendors that can be engaged by a provider or engaged in a lot of circumstances by a pharmaceutical manufacturer. And they can offer in-kind, non-monetary preventative items, goods, or services that are directly connected to the coordination and management of a patient's care. And they would be provided for free at a reduced cost. So the types of services we'll get into, the examples of services like the nursing services I talked about, or items that can help patients fall into this patient engagement and support safe harbor. And they're often provided by vendors in contrast to the actual pharmaceutical manufacturer or provider themselves, but still covered under this. So, requirements for compliance with the patient engagement and support safe harbor. We've touched upon this, but I'll emphasize that the tools and services have to be in kind and they have to be provided directly to a patient. And so in kind means, we've already defined what that means, but they have to have a direct connection to the coordination and management of care. So that's really important that, when we look at the examples, in terms of what may or may not be appropriate in terms of services or items. Again, those services or items need to have a direct connection to the coordination and management of care. If they are not directly connected, one example we use is like an iPad or an Alexa, that's not going to pass muster because that's, although there may be some relation to healthcare, that's too far, too far afoul of being directly connected. And it also raises anti-kickback concerns and the like. So we'll get into that. An important component to know if and when, hopefully this is approved, again, it's not approved, would be that the patient the services can't exceed, or items can't exceed $500 on an annual basis. All right, so let's get into our case studies. The first case study I want to talk about, and these are all real world examples, is a sub-zero refrigerator. The question is, can a company provide through a vendor or the like a sub-zero refrigerator to patients to refrigerate a product at home? I want to clarify that when we talked about this sub-zero refrigerator, this is an extremely cold, different than your standard refrigerator. This is a very low temperature refrigerator that is used to refrigerate certain prescriptions, certain medications that need to be housed at a very cold temperature. And these are, it's important to note that these are refrigerators that are not otherwise provided through insurance. If they're provided through insurance, then then they're not able to be provided under this hypothetical or scenario. But so, in terms of looking whether or not this might pass muster under the Beneficiary Inducement Statute as well as the Anti-Kickback Statute, key things to focus on are whether the free goods can be provided to patients in a way that the value goes directly to the patients and there's no value to the provider or institution. Free goods cannot be contingent upon a purchase, so they can't be tied to a particular prescription. The HCP can't only prescribe it if, prescribe a certain medication if the company is willing to provide this sub-zero refrigerator. It's subsequent or it's after the prescription, and it's an additional benefit that will aid the patient in their compliance with their prescription. We've touched upon the de minimis or nominal care limit. The limit here probably doesn't apply. I want to remind folks that the limit is $15 per year. So in discussions around, real world discussions around this as an example, the determination was that you want to go with a loaner program as opposed to giving a refrigerator. So when you first hear, and many of you may bristle, the thought of giving a refrigerator, it sounds like a gift that is just inappropriate under the Anti-Kickback Statute and is an inducement under the Beneficiary Inducement Statute. So ways to mitigate are providing this as a loaner as opposed to just outright giving the refrigerator. So you're loaned it during the time that you're taking the medication, and then you have to give it back afterward. And that's, I want to remind folks that in terms of OIG opinions and the advisory opinions that exist right now, they're all very fact specific, and they hinge on how you structure these services or providing these items. And so the way you structure it is crucial to provide comfort to the government such that they won't prosecute under any of the relevant statutes. So the loaner example is a good example of a way to structure and minimize the appearance of providing a free item and really focus on the best way to assist with patient care instead of giving a benefit to patients. So this can implicate the Anti-Kickback Statute. So other things you want to do, you don't want to advertise the freezer, advertise to healthcare professionals as well as the patients, which may impact on prescribing decisions. We've talked about the loaner. We talked about that this only is an option if insurance doesn't cover this. You want to make sure that patients return this and will sign for receiving it and returning it. Often you'll have language in a contract or otherwise language that makes it clear that you can't sell, that you have to return this, that it's only used for medical use. And so I want to next talk about, this is an example, this is a gray area. I don't want to go on the record and say this is acceptable, it's not acceptable. We are in uncharted waters with a lot of these patient service programs, these patient service items and services. And so one option is to submit for an OIG advisory opinion. I say likely, again, I want to couch that. There's no guarantee. Some of the factors that I've talked about may support the fact that you may receive a positive advisory opinion from the OIG, and that's again because when you look at the factors in terms of this being a low risk of harm to patients, unlikely to interfere with clinical decision making, it's not going to increase cost to your federal health care program. You're not raising patient safety concerns. In fact, you're minimizing safety and quality of care concerns. So that I'm touching upon again, that last factor under the Beneficiary Inducement Statute of the low risk of harm. We've also already talked about some of the considerations under the Anti-Kickback Statute. So I also want to touch upon here the positives and negatives, which may be readily apparent, but they should be noted. So to the extent that you want to request an advisory opinion, that can be, there's a cost associated with that. These are some of the, I guess, negatives. It may take some amount of time to get that advisory opinion, and so that may stunt your ability to move forward with a program like this. And then you also possibly could put yourself on the radar of the OIG or the FDA in a way that you might not have, and you open yourself up to getting a negative opinion, and then you really wouldn't want to move forward because you have a clear opinion. On the other hand, the positive is that when you submit, you're fully transparent, and to the extent that you get a positive opinion from the OIG, you know that you're fine, you're not going to be prosecuted, and so you can move forward. Hang on, sorry, okay, sorry, that was stuck for a second. Okay, let's go on to the second of 3 case studies. The next case study I want to talk about is a patient starter kit. Again, these are real world examples of some very creative and great ideas about services and items that would be given. This hypothetical would be, for instance, if you have a medication for infants. So what can you give? What types of items are appropriate as a patient service or patient item for infants to comply with getting an important prescription? So what about a medical bag for traveling? You look at the cost, $60. Unfortunately, you're not, so you're beyond the nominal value exception, and that's important. This could go either way. To the extent that the medical bag is specific to house the medication and can be used solely for housing that medication, then you likely will meet the tenets of the access to care safe harbor that we've already talked about, and you likely won't run afoul of the Anti-Kickback Statute because it's not, by definition, something, an item of value that's inappropriate. Shoot, hang on, I don't know why that went back. Hang on, sorry about that. I don't know why that happened. Okay, so really the key determination with this, and a lot of it's just a real world kind of thoughtful determination is this medical bag something that is just a bag that you can use generally, or is it specific to the medication? To the extent that it's just kind of a travel bag, likely it wouldn't be appropriate. What about a medical ID bracelet? To the extent that these are very inexpensive, you may meet the nominal value exception under the Beneficiary Inducement Statute. Kind of unclear. It seems like this is something that patients can get on their own, but to the extent that someone doesn't qualify, there's still a kind of a patient assistance program element of this, to the extent that you don't have the funds to get a required medical ID bracelet, and to the extent that this is an ID bracelet that emergency care workers and healthcare workers would needs to be worn at all times in case something happens, then there's a reasonable argument that could be made, particularly to the extent that these are de minimis costs, that you can provide something like this. Again, I'm not going to say definitively yes or no. It's more important to kind of analyze both sides. What about a baby swaddle with a port opening that's $40? So again, you're beyond the $15 nominal value exception. An argument can be made to the extent, again, this is a very specific baby swaddle with a port opening that you can't otherwise get, then you're going to meet the tenets of the access to care. Again, we could go through the low risk of harm that you likely meet because this is subsequent to a prescription. You're not adding federal healthcare costs, and you're actually improving upon patient safety and quality of care. On the other hand, if it's just a baby blanket and it's nothing special, that's probably an item that could be, and to the extent that it's over the nominal value, that it could run afoul of the Anti-Kickback Statute. Then the final two, I'm going to go out on a limb and say are not appropriate. under our analysis. The first is a portable white noise maker and or an Amazon Alexa program to remind caregivers when to administer. Amazon Alexa and other similar devices have incredible features that can help with reminders around medication and the like, but they're items of value that can be used well outside. They're not limited to patient care, and they don't pass the smell test. And it would be inappropriate. It'd be hard to argue that an Amazon Alexa, if its only medical function was to remind patients, or caregivers when to administer medication, that would be appropriate. And then what about a baby monitor to track heart rate and oxygen levels? The purpose is to give caregivers less anxiety. That's not a great purpose. If you have a specific condition that you need to track heart rate and oxygen levels, and it's, now this isn't expensive, I want to point out it's $300, but you're under, the $500 limit for the safe harbor we talked about under the Anti-Kickback Statute. I think you may have a strong argument actually, to the extent that you have a condition that needs the heart rate being tracked, and the monitor is not otherwise covered under federal healthcare insurance or your equivalent healthcare insurance, then this is one that you might want to get an advisory opinion. It's an expensive piece of equipment, but may be appropriate to provide access to care. And I want to point out the language at the bottom. So when you're seeking an advisory opinion, you want to narrowly tailor that advisory opinion to the extent that you kind of throw in a whole not bucket list, but a whole list of items and services. It starts to seem overwhelming. And again, I can't speak for the OIG, but I know that we've been counseling that you want to limit the ask, and so you want to be kind of narrowly tailor your request for an advisory opinion and not throw in a ton of stuff. Let's go on to the next. And the final example I want to touch upon is our nursing and home health services. So nursing and home health services are relatively well accepted as patient support services. So these are kind of out there. Interestingly, I looked and there's not a directly on point advisory opinion, but these are very prevalent right now, and they tend to be, I carefully use that language, tend to be accepted because they meet, again, the Beneficiary Inducement Statute, which we talked about in terms of the access to care. They, again, particularly focusing on, well, they tie to a prescription, they enhance access to care because they allow patients to better comply with prescriptions, to better understand questions around medication, better to learn about self-injections and the like. So they really assist with access to care. And they at the same time, under the Beneficiary Inducement Statute, have a low risk of harm. Again, reminding you that these nursing services are typically wholly independent from any type of prescription. So the doctor or provider will issue a prescription, and then without any knowledge of these additional nursing services, and then they're offered via a vendor, often supported by a pharmaceutical manufacturer, but the intent is to really help with access to care. So under that low risk of harm, they meet the first tenet. They're not going to add to costs which lead to overutilization or inappropriate utilization. The fact that these nursing services are provided is not going to impact whether a provider prescribes a medication or not. So you're not going to have those additional costs. And again, they're going to assist with patient safety and quality of care. So they're actually going to lower the risk of harm. So therefore is a low risk of harm. In terms of the Anti-Kickback Statute, nursing services may fit within the proposed patient engagement and support safe harbor. I won't go into the same detail I did around that, but again, looking at a lot of the similar components to the access to care exception to the Beneficiary Inducement Statute, they very likely would fall within that proposed Anti-Kickback Statute safe harbor. Again, that is not currently a safe harbor, but may support getting comfortable. But it's still a judgment call. Providing nursing services, home health services, hotline services are not without risk. And although they seem to be moving toward becoming industry standard, it's still, there's still to some degree of risk. So it's important to make that judgment call. Okay. Let me hang on. Okay. Sorry, okay, and let's conclude with best practices. So I want to provide some practical advice, which hopefully will help you to the extent that you do want to provide these patient support services or items. What are some of the things you can do to not run afoul or to not be prosecuted under, to the extent you are providing remuneration, to not be prosecuted pursuant to the Beneficiary Inducement Statute or the Anti-Kickback Statute. So, one piece of advice would be to avoid activities that could be construed as white coat marketing. This is marketing to patients. So you can't use your advisors to advocate for a particular medication or advocate for a particular company. So white coat marketing would be, again, to the extent that you are having your vendor or their agents somehow they're tied either in advance of a prescription or subsequent to that prescription, and they're really tied to that pharmaceutical manufacturer and they're advocating for a particular prescription. That would be inappropriate, or a particular company. And you want to ensure that the processes and training are mapped in a way that allow a clear defensive stance. Let's take the nursing services again, that you want to make sure when the nurses go in that they're training on a specific medication, that the services that you have, if you're ever audited, you want to have a clear policy and process put in place that shows that they're going in for to train patients on injections, for instance, to educate patients, there's a hotline that answers patient questions, but it's not open-ended, it doesn't have an improper purpose. And so I would say, always better to document what you're doing in advance. And so if you're ever audited, that is also a best practice. Remember the importance of staying on label. On label is very, very important. So to the extent you have a medication that's prescribed, and I would say that, keep using the nursing services as an example because they're what I view as the most prevalent. It'd be very important that the nurses go in and if they're helping with injections or they're answering questions, that they stay on label. It'd be very inappropriate and it would run afoul of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as well as possibly the Anti-Kickback Statute and otherwise, to the extent that the nurses or agents are answering questions that are off-label, that they're advocating for off-label utilization. So it's always important to stay on label, and it's important here. And actually, let me pause. An important piece of this that everyone wants is the second CLE code. So we've reached that magic time of 11:45. That second CLE code is UQR114. Let me repeat it again. UQR114. Thank you. So the next best practice that I'll talk about is you want to ensure that all services are provided for the good of patients rather than the benefit of the vendor or the pharmaceutical manufacturer. Seems like an easy thing, but it's, I call it kind of the smell test, or, just take a step back. When you're considering a service, when you're considering an item, why are you doing that? If you're doing it to somehow impact prescribing, if you're doing it to garner favor with patients, if there is a non-altruistic purpose, then you're likely in an inappropriate place. To the extent that the services you're providing, we talked about the refrigerator, for example. So if the refrigerator is a normal refrigerator and you're using it to somehow skew patients in favor of your drug as compared to another drug, or to make patients view the pharmaceutical company favorably or otherwise, that would be totally inappropriate. To the extent that you have a narrowly defined, low temperature refrigerator that is a loaner that can only be used to house the medication, that's going to be for the good of patients. That's for someone who otherwise can't afford that that refrigerator, and it will allow them to take the medication and to have it be kept at the appropriate temperature. So it's really important that you think about what are you providing. The example of Amazon Alexa, that is not narrowly tailored. That is something that could be, seen as a kickback, seen as an allure to patients or to providers who are aware of that. So that would be an example that's not solely for the good of patients. It could, be to inappropriately engender prescriptions or favor from patients or providers. Finally, it talked a lot about nursing services. Let's close out with nursing services in terms of best practices. You want to make sure that the nurses are not dispensing medical advice outside of the bounds of providing training and assistance with proper utilization of the medicine. So, wearing the legal hat, you want to be, and let me remind you that even if from a pharmaceutical manufacturer standpoint, you've engaged a vendor and the vendor has nurses who are going in home or operating hotlines, you expose yourself to substantial risk to the extent that they are both off-label or generally providing medical guidance outside of the narrow guidance tied to use of a particular prescription and questions around that prescription and medication. So you want to narrowly tailor what they're doing to limit your risk and also to aid patients in an appropriate manner. And with that, I would say, reminders. So let me go here first. So thank you is where I want to go, is that I really appreciate your attention. I hope that this has been educational for you. And at this point, I'm going to conclude my remarks and take questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. What a very helpful overview and presentation. All right, so we'll go ahead and turn to the questions. As you mentioned, please note to all of our attendees that we are going to continue to answer the questions up until the top of the hour, and if you have to leave, we will be providing this recording. So first question, we have quite a few questions here. So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to everybody's, but we'll do our best. So first question is, do you see the prevalence of patient support programs growing?
Good question. The short answer would be yes. I don't have a crystal ball and I can't predict the future, and I want to be careful in any predictive remarks. But it certainly seems that these types of support services and items that I've talked about are more and more prevalent. Pharmaceutical companies and vendors are finding ways to, hopefully from an appropriate standpoint, to aid patients in care, to aid patients with their compliance. And so to provide these items and services that allow, that positively impact patient care, that positively impact outcomes, seems to be more and more accepted by, based on advisory opinions and the like, by the OIG. There's an example recently of an OIG opinion relating to a loaner telephone. And again, at first glance, kind of like the refrigerators, that might sound inappropriate, but when you read that advisory opinion, it's a very narrowly tailored loaner telephone, which aids with the patient compliance with a prescription. And so based on the specific factors, the OIG stated that they're not going to prosecute under the statutes I've talked about, the Beneficiary Inducement Statute and the Anti-Kickback Statute. So there seems to be an increasing tolerance. One person's, my opinion is that yes, there's a greater prevalence.
Thank you. Second question we have is, do the recent OIG advisory opinions on patient support programs seem to indicate an acknowledgement that certain patient support services or items are acceptable? Probably already answered.
Good question. Yeah, no, I'll touch, I have, that interestingly ties to the last question, but I would say I would advise people to read the recent advisory opinions. There was a recent advisory opinion on travel services and meals. And if I remember the advisory opinion, it tied to, it was for injections that needed to take place close to the provider. And so, that you would hope that the government, that the OIG is reasonable in their analysis. And so to the extent that, again, generally providing reimbursement for travel, for meals, and travel-related costs doesn't seem appropriate. On the other hand, when you looked at the facts behind this advisory opinion and the fact that these were patients these services were not covered by insurance and they were out of pocket, and the patients needed to stay overnight to make sure that their infusions, that there weren't side effects or adverse events tied to them. So they needed to stay very close to the hospital or the health system. And so therefore it made a lot of sense. And so when you looked at the way that this program was tailored and it's really interesting. I think there was like a 5-part anti-kickback statute analysis as to why in a fact-specific way the OIG found this acceptable and stated that they would not prosecute. But so, that's an example. The loaner telephone is an example. Read the advisory opinions. They're really interesting. Maybe I find them interesting, but hopefully you do as well. There seems to be, an increasing tolerance for these types of programs by the government.
Great. I'm glad that you're in this job if you enjoy reading those opinions. Do you anticipate the proposed patient engagement and support safe harbor to the AKS will be approved?
Good question. What I would say is, I'm going to be careful on this one. I don't know. I touched upon the fact that this does seem to indicate the government's acknowledgement of services and items that enhance access to care, that enhance a patient's ability to comply with prescriptions, that enhances, patient outcomes. And I would point out that there's a reason, that this is a proposed safe harbor, that the government has acknowledged that there was not an on-point safe harbor to the anti-kickback statute. And I think there's an acknowledgement that, as we've already talked about, that there's, more and more of these types of services and items being provided. On the other hand, I can't predict the future, and I certainly can't make a statement that, it's going to be accepted or not. So I would come up with hopefully, I will say hopefully.
Thank you. Another question here. If the pharmaceutical manufacturer engages a vendor to provide certain items or services, does the Beneficiary Inducement Statute analysis tie to the pharmaceutical company or just the vendor?
Ooh, someone's been listening. Good question. That's a good specific one. So, I talked about this a bit. The answer is it ties to the pharmaceutical manufacturer, and I mentioned that in my remarks that you're not exempt if you are a pharmaceutical company and you've engaged a vendor who then has agents. Let's take the nursing services example. You look back to the money. It's there's always that statement. I don't know what the cliche is, but it all goes back to the money, or it all goes back. So yes, to the extent that an arrangement, a service is being provided by a pharmaceutical manufacturer or an item is being provided, typically that's not going to come directly from that manufacturer. It's going to be in conjunction with a vendor who then probably has their agents, but there will typically be a contract between the vendor and the pharmaceutical manufacturer. But ultimately, you'll need to look at the pharmaceutical manufacturer as the one responsible.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Any thoughts on if and how branding company logos on things like medical ID bracelet impacts this analysis?
Ooh, that is a good question. I mentioned that these items need to be provided for the benefit of patients, not for the benefit of the pharmaceutical company. So to the extent that you are branding these items, there's a, not quid pro quo, but there's a benefit to the pharmaceutical company. I don't have a definitive answer on that, but I would ask, why do you need to brand the item? Take the bracelet, I guess was the example, or a patient bracelet. There'd be no reason to brand that, and I think you'd have to have a reason why. Why are you branding it? We might take the refrigerator, for example, or some of the starter kit types of items. Again, it's not the point is to help patients with their compliance, with their ability to take the prescriptions to comply with the treatment regimen. It's not to promote the pharmaceutical company. So I will hedge and say I'm not sure, you know, that if you did have a logo on there, that it wouldn't be acceptable, but I would question why you have that logo on there.
Thank you. I think that's a good answer. You mentioned education to patients by nurses. What about pharmacists? Do you see more roles in education with medication adherence and education by a pharmacist?
The short answer, I keep saying that's a great question, so I'll stop, but I'm appreciative of these questions. Yes, I mean, I think that the type of education by a pharmacist is similar to the education by a nurse or nurse practitioner or agent. You'd want to look at the relationship between the pharmacist and the pharmaceutical manufacturer and how money is flowing. But I like to always take a step back and look at the policy. And so there is not only no reason, but there would be a great positive reason for pharmacists to serve in that educational capacity and to train and explain how to appropriately use medications. And so I think that's a great question. And I think that that's exactly the type of service that would help patients. And so to the extent that a pharmaceutical manufacturer is engaging and paying pharmacists to play that same role as nurses to train and answer questions, it feels totally appropriate to me and seems to fall directly within the types of services that we talked about here.
Thank you. I think we have time for this one last question. Since the AKS involves both the provider of the kickback as well as the recipient, does that suggest the patient who receives the kickback may be implicated?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Is that there's more, and that's something I thought a lot about, but there's, traditionally there's been a focus under the Anti-Kickback Statute on benefits to providers. And it's pretty clear, and there's a ton of guidance and as to what's inappropriate remuneration to providers. But there is an enhanced focus, given the types of services and items we're talking about, on benefits to patients. So if I understand the question, does the Anti-Kickback Statute apply to or implicate patients? Absolutely. And you can try to curry favor with patients. There's consumer-driven ads that impact patient decision-making around prescriptions. Patients now impact their care. And so absolutely, there's a focus on patients as well as providers.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. I just want to thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing your vast knowledge with us all. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today. Reminder to be on the lookout for an email in the next few days that announces the availability of both the recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck. And we sincerely hope that the information you've learned or reviewed today will be helpful to you. We wish you a wonderful remainder of your day. And thanks again, Jeremy. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Appreciate it.